It's that time of year again. The weather's getting colder, the sky's getting darker earlier. Hot cocoa seems to be on the menu a little bit more often, and hopefully in a very short amount of time, the snow will begin to fall. Welcome to the channel. This is JJ Atkins, and you are looking at a new piece for the holidays called Miles Morales and Peter Parker, A Winter Spider Wonderland. Alright, let's go ahead and get into this. Now, let me just get the shameless plug out of the way here really quick. I want to ask you just to take a moment, go down below the video, click on that big red subscribe button for me if you could, please. This especially goes for those people that haven't done it already. So let me just kind of put this out there. This channel is just over a year old right now, and we've got just over 100 subscribers, which I'm very proud of, but I'm going to ask you to kind of go out there and spread the word for me if you can. You know, share, show to your friends, see if you can get them to subscribe, especially if they have some interest in this digital artwork phenomenon that I'm kind of working with here today, okay? So let's go ahead and talk about the drawing now that I've got the plug out of the way. So I'd also like to point out here really quick that there's a very specific piece of inspiration that this artwork kind of came from. This idea that we have Peter Parker and Miles Morales, both as Spider-Man, in the same place at the same time, this winter wonderland that's New York City, has a very specific reference. This is something that's been inspired by the recent Miles Morales video game that was released for PlayStation. I didn't get it on PS5. I don't know anybody that has one, to be honest, but I did get the PS4 version, and I tore through the thing. I absolutely fell in love with it for a whole host of reasons. But what we can kind of focus on specifically is that they really kind of mastered the anatomy of Miles Morales. So let me just kind of spend a little bit of time talking about what I mean by that, and that's going to inform the artwork description that we're going to get into in just a second. So to put it loosely here, the basic concept is that we have two Spider-Men now. One that's been our original Spider-Man that's kind of grown up and he's been at the gig for a few years or so. And now he's kind of playing mentor, so to speak, to this younger version that's come along. And the fun thing about this is that this new, younger Miles Morales Spider-Man is, in fact, very young. He's roughly around the same age that Peter Parker was when he started developing his spider powers. And so this is a young 13, 14-year-old kid, kind of playing, compare and contrast to somebody who's a grown adult. And that's an interesting concept when we get into some of these anatomy studies when we're drawing these human figures. Right now, what you can see on the drawing that I'm doing right now is the Peter Parker Spider-Man figure. And the anatomy here is unusual just in the sense that not only do we have a human being that we're drawing in motion, but we're also trying to give him some sort of an insect or spider-like pose. We're going to do the same thing with the Miles Morales figure as well, but we have some differences in anatomy that we must address, or else we're really not going to get the look and feel that we're going for. And again, specifically what I'm referring to is the fact that a teenage boy is built anatomically a little bit different than a full-grown adult male. So let's take a look at some of these differences here. Again, some of this might be a little bit difficult to kind of check out and see in this picture just because we got these very unusual bent over insect-like poses. But one of the things you can kind of tell right from the get-go was that you tend to have skinnier and longer limbs and a higher set chest that might even be a little bit less defined when you get into the teenage anatomy. This is something I had to learn because I wasn't really all that familiar with it and never really paid all that much attention to it. But again, let me go back to the inspiration. The inspiration on this was the video game, and the video game did an amazing job of creating that difference between the Peter Parker version of Spider-Man and Miles Morales. Now, to kind of drill into a little bit more detail, I'll let you know that PlayStation about 2 or 3 years ago came out with a Spider-Man game featuring Peter Parker. This new game that they came out with has essentially all the same dynamics, the same setting and everything, but the main character has now been changed to Miles Morales. And the easiest thing for them as game developers to do here would have been just to take the Spider-Man animations they already had, slap a new suit on it, and say, here's a new game, enjoy. And if they'd done that, I think a lot of fans would have been disappointed because they would have seen it for what it was. But they didn't do that. They put all new animations and all new drawings in to represent the Miles figure. And again, you can see that in how he swings from building to building, in his fighting style, but more specifically in the anatomy as well. Okay, so now that we have these figures kind of roughly back on the screen here, let's take a closer look. Especially in the legs, we can kind of see it. The Peter Parker figure has these thicker, meatier, more muscular thighs, whereas Miles Morales, being more of an adolescent, hasn't quite hit puberty yet, longer, thinner, skinnier legs. And the funny thing about that is when we kind of draw like that and we get those longer, skinnier limbs out there, it actually helps make him look a little bit more insect-like. So that's all I kind of want to say about the anatomy for right now. Let's go ahead and start focusing on the color element. Now, full disclosure here, there was a little bit of a glitch in the recording of the video capture for this. For some reason, I guess my hand hit a button or a switch or something like that, and it turned off the recording for a brief period of time while I was putting in just some of my basic flat colors. So there is kind of a skip in the video there. If we can kind of forgive that and move on, we can kind of focus our attention here now on the shadows and the light, now that the flats have kind of magically just appeared. Now, from a planning stage here, there was just a couple distinct things I wanted to keep in mind as I was working through the rendering of the shadows and the lights. Obviously, the light source has to be considered here, and when we get some sort of a cityscape background happening like this, there's a couple considerations. Number one, I certainly have some sort of a sky or sunlight that I'm dealing with, and you can see here that the intent is that this is mostly going to be an overcast sky. You may have seen the final product in the end here, so you kind of know what's coming. But the snow that's really kind of important to this scene doesn't really kind of come into the drawing until the last couple of steps. So you're not going to see it for the bigger part of this video here, but I know in the back of my head that it's coming in, and an overcast sky and these gray and blue tones is going to be necessary. I also know that because the snow is going to be falling pretty heavily, that's going to create really kind of a certain depth in the picture when it comes to these background buildings. Right now, they kind of look up close and personal to the figures that are in the foreground here, but they are going to get kind of pushed back, so to speak, by some of the rendering that we do later. Some filters are going to be applied to give something some more of a bluish tone to it to help it fade a little bit. The snow is going to be added in as well. That's going to help give it some more depth because that snow is going to go on a few different layers, kind of stacked on top of each other. And then the last thing we're going to do when we get towards the end here is we're also going to put a slight blur on anything that's in the background. The buildings that are in the far background are going to get, not a huge blur, but enough of it to let you know that this thing's sitting in the background a little bit. And because Miles Morales is meant to be sitting in front of Peter Parker's Spider-Man, Peter Parker is also going to get a very, very small slight blur on him, just to help him recede in the background just a tad. It's going to be barely noticeable, but it's going to be enough to help trick the eye a little bit and help give you some three-dimensionality in this piece. Again, that's all final stages here. I'm really kind of working on just kind of getting my light and shadow rendering fixed up first. So the background thing here, I just wanted to speak to briefly and just say, you may notice that there's some line work in there, but not a whole lot of detail. And the reason for that is because I know it's just going to get blurred anyway, so the detail really isn't all that necessary in this stage. The whole idea is to draw your attention to the dynamics of the figures swinging towards you in the foreground, so that's where I'm going to focus on my detail, because that's going to get the least amount of blur, if any at all. Now, one of the other things that kind of came from the video game is the costume that Miles is wearing. The traditional black and red costume is pretty common to the movies that he's been in and the comic books as well. But what I'm really kind of referring specifically to is the leg warmers, the scarf, and the winter hat. This is something that came from the video game. Again, the whole Winter Wonderland in New York kind of concept is something that was also inspired by the video game. This whole thing is set during the kind of that New Year's, Christmas type period of time. So snow falling in New York and Miles getting cold and at one point putting on some additional cold weather gear was something that happened in the video game, and it just kind of helped kick off this whole inspiration for what I wanted to do in this piece here. To be frank, I love doing kind of thematic type artwork around the holidays. So you probably know, if you've watched my channel, I got a lot of Halloween stuff out there. And, you know, Christmas, Hanukkah, that general holiday season is another fun time for me as well. I typically like to draw little Santa Claus images and stuff like that, but I thought I'd kick off the season by doing something that was just kind of inspired by something a little bit different. So I hope you appreciate it and enjoy it. Now, one of the things I like to point out in terms of the shadowing and rendering is some specifics related to Miles. When I put in the flat colors for his suit, I know that the suit's black and red, but I wanted to be able to make sure that we didn't go pure black right away. So our flat color is more of a mid-tone in kind of a charcoal gray, and that gives me some leeway, some bandwidth, so to speak, to go a little bit darker so I can emphasize where shadow exists. It's really kind of a tricky thing to pull off because, for the most part, his costume is very monotone. And it kind of reminds me of the old Spider-Man back in the 80s or so, or maybe early 90s, where he had that black suit for a while that looked a lot like Venom. I can't imagine being the artist trying to draw that all the time, because other than just putting like a black dot on the page, how do you offer any sort of definition to the anatomy, like creases in the muscle or something like that? So that became something of a challenge, and one of the ways that I was able to solve it is by bringing in some of those additional elements like the leg warmers and the scarf. Let's take a look at those leg warmers in particular. If you notice, we have curved lines or curved stripes going down the leg, and that helps add some form to the already existing shadow that I put in there. We can see other examples of line helping to dictate form in the Peter Parker Spider-Man costume also. Take a look at those curved lines that go around the fingers there. Because of the direction those curves go, that helps lend some three-dimensional illusion to things and gives that impression to your eye that the finger's kind of poking out towards the camera, so to speak. Now, I've gone into some detail about why this works and the optical illusion that's being achieved here through line and form. This is a video I've talked about before, and as a matter of fact, it was actually brought up in a previous Spider-Man video I did. So I'm going to put up a little tag or a little card up in the upper right-hand corner just right now. And what I'd like you to do is go ahead and just click on it. Take a look at that other Spider-Man picture. It was actually inspired by the Tom Holland Spider-Man movies from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But there's a really interesting lesson there where I break down line and how line helps cheat form and give us three-dimensional illusions. So if you have some interest in that, go check it out. But again, you can kind of see some examples of it here as well. The whole idea of the spider webbing that goes in the costume helps create curved lines, and the curved lines help fool the eye into thinking there's some illusion of depth, three-dimensionality, of form, and this idea that there is something solid sitting on the page in front of you. Now, there's other ways that we try to achieve that form and that illusion, and that's through light and shadow, but the lines really kind of help sell this quite a bit also. So again, go check out that video if you get a chance. But in the meantime, I'll just kind of get back to this piece here by talking a little bit more just about some of the choices I made when it came to the light and the shadow. So as I mentioned before, our sky is going to be largely overcast, but it's still our light source. So our light is going to be something of we're going to call it a cool light or a bluish light. And I want to apply that same theory to the light source that's coming from the city below them. There's street lights, cars, people, buildings, and so on and so forth, all of which in some way, shape, or form are probably shedding some sort of a light. So we really have two competing light sources that we're dealing with here, from above and from below. If you notice the black rectangle up towards the top of the piece there, you can see the 5 colors I've laid out to be my palette for light and shadow. This is something very typical to when I do comic book type color rendering and shadow rendering like this, but there is a little bit of a difference in how I'm doing it this time. What you may notice here is that the 2 colors on the left-hand side of that palette are different. They're warm shadows. What they really are more than anything else is something of a yellowish orange, but is brought into a more gray scale. So I want a warm gray more than anything else. Again, basically what that means is there is a hint of an orangish yellow color in it, but it's very, very desaturated, very much heavily weighted on the gray end of things. But I've got that hint of color in there that's going to help me achieve some interesting things with shadow. Now, right next to it, it's just a darker version of that, a more blackish or charcoal gray version of that orange-yellow color. I'm going to use both of these for my shadow colors. I have some areas that are going to be more of a lighter shadow, and then I have other areas that are going to be more of a deeper, darker shadow. From there, I have 3 other colors. These are all going to be my light colors. I have something of a bluish white, then I have something that goes a little bit more white, but it's not quite there, and then I have almost the pure white that I'll use very, very sparingly just for this slight highlight that might pop up here and there. Now, the whole idea about how this palette works is that I'm using the palette with blend layers to help achieve the effects I'm working on. So all the shadow work that you see in my figures and in the buildings and everything like that was all achieved using only the 2 colors on the left-hand side of my palette, my 2 warm shadow colors. And this was achieved by basically putting a series of layers into my piece that were set to a blend mode of multiply. I've talked about multiply blend modes and shadows quite a bit in a lot of my videos, so I won't belabor the point any more than that. But other than say that I've done basically the opposite thing and gone to a hard light blend mode for my lights. Now, I usually work with cool shadows and warm light. I've done the opposite this time. Cool light, warm shadow. And the reason for this is because of the atmosphere I'm trying to create. Everything in here is winter, so we have overcast skies, snow. All my light is going to be very, very cool light. My shadows will be warm to complement that, and when the snow gets in, that'll help tie everything together. One of the other things that this helps achieve is this concept of contrast in my piece. I want these figures to really sit out in the foreground, so they're very bold, bright colors as opposed to the cool, kind of muted colors in the background. So I hope that makes sense to you, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I hope you got something out of this, and make sure you stop back soon. I've got more to come. Take care.